And good morning, everyone, and welcome to the speaker series of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UC Berkeley. I'm Susan Hoffman, Ollie at Berkeley's director, and I'm delighted that you could join us for what will be a fascinating talk by our colleague, David Hollinger. Let me say a few words about David, but before I do that, let me just express how delighted we are that you could join us today. Also know that we will be recording today's talk. It will be captioned and available sometime next week. Should you wish to share it, it will be available. We'll send it to you by email. It will be on the Ollie YouTube site. David will speak for the first 45 minutes, and then he'll take your questions. And we ask that you put those questions in the chat room, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So with that, let me say, David, welcome. David Hollinger is the Preston Hotchkis Professor of History Emeritus here at Berkeley, where he's been on the faculty since 1992, but he was a doctoral student in the 1960s. Professor Hollinger has written 9 books, and the most recent is Christianity's American Fate: How Religion Became More Conservative and Society More Secular. David is the former president of the Organization of American Historians and an elected member of both the American Academy of Arts and Science and the American Philosophical Society. David, we're delighted to have you with us today, and if you would take the digital platform.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm very glad to be speaking on the OLLI Forum, institution that I've had a lot of respect for many years, so I'm very glad to be here. Christianity was once a vast, multitudinous force in the United States, invoked as a justification for a great many causes, providing communities for millions and millions of Americans with strikingly different social needs. The United States, well into the 20th century, was one of the most overwhelmingly Christian, indeed Protestant societies in the world. Christianity's always been big in this country, argued about, but a big deal, covering many kinds of things. Today, however, Christianity has become an instrument for the most politically, culturally, and theologically reactionary of Americans. Now, of course, there are Catholics, there are African-American Protestants, there are non-evangelical white Protestants, but all of the numbers of those people are declining, and their relative role in public life is now small compared with the role in public life of the white evangelical Protestants. What's happened is that most of Christianity's symbolic capital has been seized by a segment of the population committed to ideas about the Bible, the family, civics, that most Americans actually reject. So how did this happen? How and why did the role of Christianity in the United States change so strikingly? Well, I will argue that white evangelical Protestantism rose to prominence not through the force of its own ideas and momentum, as some writers imply, but rather I will argue that white evangelical Protestantism comes to prominence in a dialectical relationship with the rival mainline ecumenical churches. Too often, we are told the story of evangelicalism's triumph in a vacuum. It was more complicated than that. We need to understand the dynamics of the ecumenical evangelical divide, which enables us to see that evangelicalism flourished as a safe harbor for Americans who wanted to be counted as Christians without facing the challenges that the more liberal ecumenical wing of American Protestantism thought needed to be confronted. Now, there were two big challenges that these liberal Protestants said, look, we Christians have got to deal with this stuff. And the first challenge was that of an ethno-racially diverse society. The second challenge was of a scientifically informed culture. So we need to understand the dynamics of the controversy, of the disagreement about those challenges, which evangelicalism says we don't have to worry that much about that. And the ecumenicals, the liberals, said, well, look, we got to face this stuff. We also need to take account of the secularization process as the better educated Protestants and Catholics drifted out of the churches into a generalized post-Protestant, post-Catholic secularism. Now, what this does, what secularization does, is that it leaves Christianity as a kind of a hollowed out edifice that was then occupied aggressively by white evangelicals, financed by right-wing, oil-rich billionaires who see evangelical voters, because of their suspicion of regulation, their tendency to look at things individually rather than as a society. They see evangelical voters as a support for rolling back the regulatory regime of the New Deal. Okay, so about this ecumenical evangelical divide. Many of us are old enough to remember a time when American Christianity was dominated by the so-called mainline churches, the old Protestant establishment led by the Congregationalists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, Unitarians, Quakers, Disciples, a number of Lutheran bodies, some of the Baptist bodies. I mean, as late as 1960, if you were in the position to influence the direction of the society in business, in the foundations, in any of the three branches of government, the chances are that you were nominally affiliated with one of these classic Protestant denominations. There were exceptions to that, of course. But statistically, if you look at the American leadership as late as 1960, it's overwhelmingly mainline Protestant. Now, the term mainline is a problematic term. It's not a religious term. It refers to a kind of established class-based position, and there's justification for that. These Protestant denominations tended to have pretty strong class position. However, by the time the term catches on, and it doesn't really get much use until about 1960, shortly after the term catches on, it's anachronistic. By the 1970s and 1980s, these people are not in the mainstream. The evangelicals are taking over. So we're sort of saddled with this term, mainline. Even today, I mean, if you look at something like all these statistics that are done by the Pew Foundation or Gallup, or you read articles in the Washington Post or the New York Times, they keep referring to mainline Protestants. Well, okay, but they're really not as major a deal as they once were. So the term is anachronistic. Another term that's sometimes used is liberal. Oh, these are liberal Protestants. Well, okay, there's a basis for that. The theological views of these organizations, these denominations, was more liberal than the fundamentalists and the evangelicals. But also, they also have a more liberal politics. But the thing is that liberal is, again, not a religious term. So we have, on the one hand, evangelical, which is indeed a religious term. So what I prefer is the term ecumenical, rather than liberal or mainline. And that's because ecumenical actually refers to a religious style that these people have, and that distinguishes them quite strikingly from the evangelicals. They're ecumenical in that they work a lot together and with people who are not even Christians. They work a lot with Catholics, work a lot with non-Christians, work a lot with different organizations all over the world. And one of the reasons that the evangelicals don't like these liberal Protestants is that they're felt to be without principle, that they will, consort with all sorts of different kinds of people. So there's a problem with the term, but I'll be using them sort of interchangeably as I go on. Now, by the mid-1940s, the leadership groups in all of these ecumenical denominations and in the trans-denominational organizations that they were part of, all of these groups had leadership cadres that began an ambitious campaign to make American Protestantism more cosmopolitan, to make it more responsive to modern conditions. So what were the main elements in this campaign, and why did it take form at that time? Well, this campaign demanded that public authority defend the rights of Black people, sharpen the separation of church and state to allow for the development of a more fully secular and open public sphere. Demanded also that the United States renounce narrow nationalism, strong support for the United Nations. These people, as part of their campaign for a cosmopolitan more cosmopolitan Protestantism, welcomed as legitimate a whole variety of faith orientations. They encouraged theologies that were consistent with modern science. They condemned Jim Crow. They took a strong stand against the old European empires. I need to just move my notes up here a little bit. They made quite a mark for themselves by attacking imperialism and colonialism. They sided with a lot of the non-white decolonizing peoples around the world. They were prominent in advancing sex education in the schools. They were prominent in defending Alfred Kinsey's famous reports on sexual behavior. In the mission field, they argued that converting people to Christianity was too imperialistic, too colonialist, and so they moved their missionary project largely from proselytizing and preaching into service projects. They were huge supporters of the United Nations, and they were actually centrally involved in the United Nations. The US government partnered with the leaders of these ecumenical churches and the American Jewish Committee, got them together to go to San Francisco at the founding of the United Nations, and they actually introduced a number of ideas for the UN Charter that were adopted. So they were very much part of the establishment. This campaign for a more cosmopolitan Protestantism was especially strong on opposing Jim Crow. And it's interesting that in their national meetings, when these people would hold a national conclave of some sort in 1946, even as early as 1942, they would insist on meeting in a city where the African American delegates would be given service at the local hotels. Now, most hotel associations in the United States in the 1940s still had segregation. So these ecumenical Protestants held almost all of their meetings in two cities, Philadelphia and Cleveland, because those are the only places where you could get the local hotel association to promise that African Americans would be given full service rather than forced to go to some segregated hotel, which was still the case in New York, Boston, Chicago, a lot of places. So that's an example of where they really made a special mark. And a lot of their organizations in the 40s and early 50s were very strong on integrating the YMCA, the YWCA, Federal Council of Churches. Maybe the most important of these ecumenical Protestant organizations was one founded in 1941, Church Women United. Millions and millions of church ladies were part of this organization, which was generally more progressive on almost every issue than any of the denominations. So if you're a Presbyterian or a Methodist, the women tended to say, oh, well, the guys running this church, they're just too conservative. So the Church Women United in little communities all over the United States would press these liberal ideas. Now, the place to see the campaign for a more cosmopolitan Protestantism the most directly are the pages of the Christian Century, which is the magazine that's sort of the house organ of the old Protestant establishment of these mainline denominations. So the Christian Century, beginning really back in the 20s and 30s, talks a lot about this. But by the 1940s, 1950s, they're really out there advancing these ideas. And many of the leading preachers and seminary professors and heads of denominations wrote books, articles, advancing these liberal views. Now, why at this time? Why the 1940s and the early 1950s? Well, part of it was the accelerating level of education on the part of the Protestant leadership. These are people that went to a lot of the leading colleges. They're prominent in all the Ivy League colleges, and then you have a leadership by the 1920s and 30s that's very well educated. And then there are two specific things, large events that happen in the United States between about 1920 and 1960 that had a huge impact on the educated liberal Protestant leadership. First big event was the blowback from the missionary project. Now, these denominations send thousands and thousands of missionaries abroad, well, beginning really in the 1820s, but especially beginning about 1895. They send missionaries to Japan and India and China and Nigeria and the South Pacific and the Middle East. And after a couple generations of experience, and sometimes just on the basis of a very short time abroad, many of these Presbyterian and Methodist missionaries, they report back to their organizations in the US and they say, look, we're making a mistake. These people should not be thought of as heathens. They're really interesting human beings, and they have cultures that have real integrity. So the idea of our constantly going over there and saying, oh, you heathens, you're bowing down to wood and stone, and you really ought to be more like us. Not all, but many of the missionaries, they developed deep ambivalence about this. And so they would come back, and you'd go to a regional or national assembly of Presbyterians or Methodists, and these missionaries on furlough would give these very tough lectures about how, we got to loosen up a little bit. We think we're so much better than everybody else. Well, I don't know about that. And then their children, the children of the missionaries, the kids that grew up in China or Japan or India, when they grow up, they end up being very far out compared with the other white Protestants in their milieu. So they push their denominations further in this cosmopolitan direction and further in siding with the decolonizing non-white people from around the world. They insist that the missionary projects that we Presbyterians, we Methodists, we Congregationalists, and so forth have in different places, they insist that they be turned into service projects. Rather than trying to convert all these people to make them more like us, we've got to be cooperative with them. We've got to turn them into service projects. So the missionary impact on the churches was really profound. Now, this is happening at the same time that the missionary project has a big impact on public life, because a lot of the missionary children leave the churches and they become people like Pearl Buck, the Nobel Prize, the great novelist of the time. She's a missionary daughter from China. John Hersey, author of Hiroshima, another a missionary child. So these people leave the churches, but they have a big cosmopolitan effect on the society as large. Like Pearl Buck is remembered as having had biggest influence on Western attitudes toward China than anybody since Marco Polo. So you have a public culture effect of the missionaries. But what I'm emphasizing right now, for the purposes of what I'm explaining today, is the impact that they have in the churches, producing tremendous impetus for this cosmopolitan project. Now, something that happens during the same period of about 1920 to 1960, when you get the blowback from the mission, something else that's happening is that the educated Protestant leadership is taking more account of a non-Christian population in the United States. Now, again, this is overwhelmingly Christian society. People may be nominal about it, maybe not church-going, but there's assumption that Christianity is a really big thing. So, especially in the 1920s and 30s, but above all, 40s and 50s, they begin to notice American Jews. Now, some are Judaic, religiously observant Jews. A lot are secular Jews. These are the descendants of the pre-1924 migration. Remember, the Congress cut off immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe in 1924. But these are also the famous Einstein-era emigres. All these writers and scientists and artists that come over in the 1930s and 40s, escaping Hitler's Europe. Now, these people are very prominent. They already have world reputations, and they make a real mark. And so the ecumenical leaders encounter these people in the universities, in politics, and other institutions, and they begin arguing, look, we've got to make room for non-Christians. So the significance of the Jewish population was not so much that they were Judaic, although many of them were. The significance of it was that they were not Christians. Now, Catholics, of course, there are more Catholics by far than Jews in American society. And the liberal Protestants tended to be pretty badly prejudiced against Catholics, actually. A lot of anti-Catholic talk on the part of these liberal Protestants I'm talking about. But they had to pay attention to these Jews, and they were aware of the fact that, unlike the Catholics, the Jews aren't even Christians. So what are we doing talking about this as a Christian society when there are more and more non-Christians, and the non-Christians are becoming increasingly prominent? So by the 1960s, non-Christians are increasingly visible in a whole lot of domains. In, say, the leading universities, 17% of the faculty by the late 1960s was Jewish. In the law schools, 36% of all the leading law professors were Jews by 1969. And there are other kind of sectors where this happens, not only in academia, psychotherapy. Okay, this is a period, 1920 to 1960, when the clinical psychologists take over more and more of the role as public moralists that had once been performed by ministers. So you have a secularization of counseling, and Jewish psychotherapists are very much involved in that. You didn't have to be a psychoanalyst. There are other kinds of things, but of course, psychoanalysis was very big, and it was founded, after all, by a Jewish intellectual who thought religion was superstition. So there's a trend there that a lot of these leading liberal Protestants, they pick up on, and they begin criticizing their own kind, their own tribe, for this constant riff about how, gee, we're a Christian society. Well, we're not, said a lot of the leading theologians and preachers by the late 1950s. So this is going on, and these two things, the missionary project and the missionary project and the awareness of the Jewish intellectuals I'm seeing have a lot to do with. I'm just trying to get my notes here properly set up. Has a lot to do with the intensity, the range of this campaign for a cosmopolitan Protestantism. Now, this campaign, this set of initiatives, was opposed by the fundamentalists, the old fundamentalists from the 20s and 30s, whose leaders began during World War II to no longer call themselves fundamentalists. Same group, but they began to call themselves evangelicals. Now, evangelical is a term with a long history. It used to apply to sort of any Christian who was trying to get other people to join up to evangelize. But this conservative group, this culturally, politically conservative leadership of the fundamentalists were embarrassed by the old term of fundamentalism, and they began to call themselves evangelicals. Now, this is a persuasion that draws on a long tradition in American history of individual rather than socially focused religion. It's a persuasion that makes a lot of personal, intimate relationships with God and Jesus. It's a tradition that reads the Bible much more literally than it's read by the mainline ecumenical Protestants. It's highly sectarian. It's a Manichaean style that stresses there's the you're in and you're out, you're good or bad. There's a striking world historical great battle going on. And these people are also really committed to the old missionary project. And it's interesting that even in the 1920s and 30s, when we talk about the fundamentalist modernist dispute, we often give a lot of attention to the Scopes trial and evolution and Darwin and all that. Actually, the fundamentalists were much more concerned with missionary theory and practice. Yeah, they were, unhappy about evolution. And we talk about that a lot because it's so easy to understand. And how could these people possibly take missionaries that seriously? Well, they did. They took missionaries very seriously. So a lot of the fiercest fights between fundamentalists and modernists in the 1920s and 30s actually have to do with what's going on in missions. So part of the reaction that I'm talking about against these cosmopolitan types has to do with the mission field. Now, these evangelicals, beginning in the early 1940s and down through the 50s, very aggressively and adroitly developed a set of institutions that remain important to this day. In 1942, they established the National Association of Evangelicals, where a variety of these different groups and denominations and quasi-denominational groups joined together specifically to fight against the Federal Council of Churches, which was the national organization of all these mainline ecumenical groups. National Association of Evangelicals, 1942. In 1947, they established the Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. Now, this is designed explicitly to fight, guess what? Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, Union Theological Seminary in New York, Chicago Div School, Harvard Div School, Yale Div. So they want their own seminary where they could have learned foundation for their ministry. Very big deal, important to this day. Another institution they established at this time, in 1956, they established the magazine Christianity Today. Now, this was to fight the Christian Century. The Christian Century, the house organ of the liberals. Christian Century gets going in 1956 through a huge contribution from the oil billionaire Howard Pugh. Now, Christianity Today immediately swamps Christianity, the Christian Century, because Pugh finances the sending of it to thousands and thousands of ministers all over the United States. So we often hear it said, oh, well, evangelicalism, it spoke to the hearts of Americans. Yeah, well, it may have done that, but it also spoke to the pocketbook of a lot of these billionaires who were very eager to make their alliance with the evangelical voters. And so they come in to the evangelical circles, and in 1956, they support this magazine, which has changed a lot over the years. If any of you looked at Christianity Today in the last 10 years or so, you'll see that it's changed a lot. Their editor even came out against Trump recently. But in the early days, this was hardcore fundamentalist evangelicalism. The first article that they published about school integration in 1956, for example, supported Jim Crow. This is 2 years after school board decision. Now, in 1949, the National Association of Evangelicals proposed a constitutional amendment. They wanted to put God and Jesus right in the federal Constitution. Didn't work. So it happens again in 1954. Put God and Jesus right in the Constitution. Now, one of the reasons it didn't fly is because the leaders of the evangelical churches refused to support it. This is too narrow. We shouldn't do this. We shouldn't make the United States so narrowly a Christian society. Now, that's an important part of what was going on at that time, and I wish more people were aware of it today, because we hear a lot of chatter to the effect that that Christian nationalism is a new thing, and it's something that's somehow been brought into evangelicalism, but that's actually not true. Christian nationalism was a really important part of evangelicalism from a long way back. Lots of Christian nationalism going on. So in terms of this dynamic, this rivalry between these two kinds of Protestantism, we need to remember that evangelical Protestants, the Americans that decided they were really into evangelical Protestantism, they had a choice. They had a choice. The ecumenical churches were very much at hand. Right in the middle of almost every city and town in the United States, you've got the Methodists on one corner and the Congregationalists on the other, and the Lutherans are just a block or so away. So ecumenical Protestantism is right there. And it's important to remember that ecumenical Protestantism was led by people who were just as white as Billy Graham. Race explains a great deal in our society, but not everything. White evangelicalism is not only white, it is also evangelical. It provides a religious frame for people to engage race and everything else. So the evangelicalism that we see around us in the 21st century took form not in a spiritual vacuum, but in the public arena. It took place as white Americans decided where they were religiously. Evangelicals chose to reject a version of Protestantism that proclaimed a more commodious view of the faith and a more pluralistic, diverse, inclusive view of the nation. Now, people like Billy Graham assured their audiences that you could be a good Christian while paying no attention whatsoever to any of this stuff. The challenge of a ethno-racially diverse society, well, yes, but that's not what Christianity is about. The challenge of modern science and bringing your theology up to date, well, that's not important either. Stick with the Bible. The Bible says what it means, and it means what it says, okay? Now, when people were called to accept Christ, there was a very different understanding of this for Graham and the evangelicals than for the ecumenicals I've been talking about. For Billy Graham, to accept Christ, well, this meant staying largely within the inherited culture for which Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post covers was a popular emblem, but being better at it, being better at living up to the self-image of that culture. So this means following the golden rule, being loyal to your spouse, avoiding drugs, don't abuse alcohol, avoid same-sex relationships, be a good neighbor. You know somebody who needs a helping hand, do it. And support the established American political and economic order until its injustices are gradually corrected by changes in the human heart. Now, these things were not demonstrable signs of God's grace, but they were expected, as a matter of course, by people who went to Graham's altars. That was enough. Now, for these ecumenical Protestant leaders, that was not enough. That was not enough. Instead, you had to come to grips with an ethno-racially diverse society and a scientifically sophisticated culture. Graham thought racism was bad, but he and people like him thought it would be a mistake to use civil authority against it. It was an evil of the human heart. Now, there's no greater emblem for the ecumenical evangelical divide as it existed in the United States in 1963 than the contrast between Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial that year and Billy Graham's response when the press asked him what he thought of that. What do you think of Dr. King's speech? Graham said, little white children and little black children in Alabama will walk hand in hand only when Christ comes again. So there's a very different view of how you approach racial injustice. Now, to be sure, a lot of evangelical churchgoers were only marginally invested in the policy positions taken by their organizations and famous preachers. Local congregations, evangelical or ecumenical, provided vital community adhesives for lots and lots of Americans. The ecumenical evangelical divide was sharper in some cities and towns and rural areas than in others. But it was a very important part of American life during these decades. And just as the fundamentalist modernists split in the 1920s divided these Protestants, the ecumenical evangelical divide was very real. Now, again, in some communities, it wasn't as intense as others, but any number of autobiographies and memoir writing by American Protestants of different kinds recounts what this contrast was like and what it was like to grow up in an evangelical church or an ecumenical church. And I can remember I went to high school in the 50s in Southern California. My high school years were 1955 to 1959. And I confronted the ecumenical evangelical divide every day that I went to school. We had in my high school, which is a very average, generic Southern California high school, lots of evangelicals. They were almost all from families that had moved to Southern California from Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Tennessee. And I remember how striking it was. These people were really into Christianity, but it wasn't the kind of Christianity that I was used to. My parents, as liberal Protestants, their greatest hero was the self-effacing missionary doctor, Albert Schweitzer. And I remember pushing that on these guys, these friends, and they'd never heard of Albert Schweitzer, but they sure had heard of Billy Graham. So I would hear a lot about that. This was all very cordial, I suppose, but I remember at our graduation in 1959, a guy that I'd had jovial arguments with about theology for 4 years. He comes up to me and says, "David, I want you to know that people like you will be destroyed at the Battle of Armageddon." Now, was he being ironic? Maybe, although there was enough seriousness to it, since I'd argued with him a lot. I only mention that as a personal indication of something that goes on at a lot of different kinds of places all over the place. Now, there's some Berkeley specific aspects to this evangelical ecumenical divide that I want to call your attention to, that some of you might be interested in, and I don't think it's very widely known. And one is that in 1942 and 1943, Berkeley liberal Protestants were way in the lead of defending Japanese Americans. So Berkeley was sort of the headquarters for the organizations that tried to protect the Japanese Americans, that opposed their internment, that went to serve their needs as best they could when they were at Manzanar and Tule Lake and these other places. And it was Sproul was important in this, and the provost, Monroe Deutsch. And it's interesting that former President Barrows, and as many of you are aware, we recently renamed Barrows Hall because of things that he said about Filipinos, and he had been governor or very prominent in the Philippines, and said and did things that are suitably rejected today. But one interesting thing about Barrows is that in 1941 and 1942, he was one of the most vocal defenders of the Japanese Americans. And so he spoke up and he helped mobilize people at UC Berkeley and in the surrounding areas. And it was actually a bunch of retired missionaries that staffed all the organizations. So you have these Congregationalist and Methodist missionaries that came back from China and Japan, and Barrows is able to get them to run these organizations defending the Japanese Americans. And connected with that was the Pacific School of Religion that I mentioned a while ago. The actual head of the local organization protecting Japanese Americans was the chair of the board of trustees at the Pacific School of Religion, and the president up there and many of their faculty were involved in this. So if you look all over California, all over the West Coast, and you look for places where people stood up for the Japanese Americans, okay, there's some in Los Angeles, there's a handful in Seattle, okay, but mostly it was right here. It was Berkeley that was way in the lead. Pacific School of Religion, I mentioned also because Pacific School of Religion really was a national presence at that time, more than it has become in more recent years. Their faculty wrote some of the most important books in this movement for a more cosmopolitan Protestantism. Buell Gallagher, one of their most famous professors at that time, was also the co-minister of an integrated black-white church in South Berkeley, and became very close to Howard Thurman, the great black preacher in San Francisco. So PSR and Berkeley generally was right in the forefront of this campaign for cosmopolitan Protestantism. Now, in the late 1960s, the ecumenical churches of which I've been making so much began to decline in numbers. And the decline accelerated in the last quarter of the 20th century. By the end of the century, the United Methodist membership was down by 28%, and it continued to decline in the 21st century. The United Presbyterians also lost numbers about the same level, same with the Episcopalians, the United Church of Christ. Now, why was this? Was it because evangelicals moved over to, was it because some of their members, some of the ecumenicals moved over to evangelical churches? Well, yes, there was some of that. The ecumenicals were too liberal, so you go over to the safe harbor for people like yourselves. There was some of that, but actually not much. There were three other things that were much more important in the decline of liberal Protestantism. And one was the exodus of the young. Many of the people that grew up in Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian homes decided not to join up when it came time for them to do so. They left. So the exodus of the young that were often caught up in national movements, national secular movements, they decided they really didn't need the church. Statistics, huge, big difference. I mean, that they just weren't joining up as their parents and grandparents had. So the exodus of the young, big deal. Second factor, lower birth rates. Now, birth rates don't change in a vacuum. There's a cultural context. So what happens is that the ecumenical churches endorse contraception, and they endorse a broader role for women in the workforce. So the birth rate goes down, and as a result, cumulatively, you have fewer women of childbearing age in the churches. So while this birth rate is going down in the ecumenical churches, it's going up in the evangelical churches, who have a different view of gender, different view of where women are, and the evangelical birth rate in the baby boom years is actually greater than the Catholic birth rate. You know, traditionally people say, "Oh, the Catholics are having all these children." Well, actually, the evangelicals were having more than the Catholics during the baby boom years in the 20th century. Third factor, I'm going to finish up here in a minute and see what questions you have. Third factor is the ecumenical churches found it harder to recruit in the 1980s and after. Now, most of the new Presbyterians and Methodists in earlier years had been people moving up from the Nazarenes, from the Assembly of God, from the Southern Baptist. As they achieve upward social mobility, they become more respectable, so they join respectable churches. Now, that kind of recruiting dropped off pretty dramatically in the 70s and 80s because evangelicalism became so much more prominent. The Republicans helped to put it there. So the Republicans and their prominence, their alliance with these evangelicals had put evangelicalism so much on the map that no longer did you have to be mainline to be mainstream. And also, in order to move up to the Presbyterians, you had to put up with all these liberal preachers that wanted to have you deal with all this stuff about integration and science and all. And while this is going on, while the ecumenical churches are declining in this way, you have the Republican Party endorsing and developing the Southern strategy, which is what consolidates the evangelical support politically with the Republicans. Now, in the last few days, there have been a number of obituaries and stories about Kevin Phillips. So we've been reading a lot about the Southern strategy, and just briefly to remind you that what happens here is that the Republican strategists decide that the more Black people vote, the more white Southerners will switch from the Democrats to the Republicans. So it's a racial calculation. The Republicans decide that they will build their electoral future on the Southern states and a good bit of the Western states that they get. So they basically write off the Northeast, California, Washington, and Oregon as part of that Southern strategy. And this accounts for what we have today with the great dependence of the Republican Party on these white evangelical voters and the willingness of the white evangelical voters to get their way because the Republicans are on the side that they're on all sorts of national issues. Where do Catholics fit into all of this? Well, they decline in almost the same way as the ecumenical Protestants. Between the 1970 and about 10 or 15 years ago, the Catholic Church had lost 40% of its traditional European white ethnic base. There were Hispanics that were coming in. That's true, but the old constituency of the Catholic Church declined very rapidly during that time. I'll conclude by just observing that the United States now is in an interesting paradox, that we have an increasingly secular society. I mean, the last polls show almost a third of Americans aren't even affiliated with any religious thing at all. And you have more and more non-Christians around. So we have an increasingly secular society, but we have an increasingly religious politics because of the way in which the Republicans and the evangelical Protestants, in dealing in the context of the Electoral College and all that, have achieved this remarkable dominance. What's going to happen in the future? Well, I'm not sure, but it depends on who's got the franchise. Now, what happens now is that the evangelical Protestants have the franchise. When I say franchise, I mean, look, we're looking here at a world historical project. The Christian project's been around for a couple thousand years, and it's taken different forms depending on who gets control of it. You can go back to any number of aspects of Christian history and see how different Christianity is. After all, you've got 30,000 verses in the Bible. You might pick 2 or 3 that you think are really important and, found a church around that. So it depends on who's got the franchise. Now, the liberal Protestants used to have the franchise in the United States, but they've lost it. The white ecumenical Protestants, they have the franchise now. And going to keep it? I don't know. Will the liberal Protestants fight back? I haven't seen very many signs of that. So I'm not sure what's going to happen, but the signs right now seem to indicate that the evangelical Protestants are going to remain in charge. All right, I'll stop at that point, and if there are questions, I'll do what I can with them.
David, thank you very much. We have several questions that have come through, and one of the things I was going to just let you know about, last week we had our Words Over Time, which is a conversation dialogue between undergraduates and OLLI members. Excuse me, and the topic was cultural identity. And one of the things that was much to our surprise when asked to identify the sort of 3 areas of cultural identity most important to you, that there was a difference between young and old, and that the young were, I want to say 24% higher than their elders around religious affiliation. Does that surprise you at all?
That young people are latching onto religious affiliation?
Correct.
It very much is contrary to all the statistics that are collected by not only Pew, but also by Gallup. So it may be a local phenomenon or something responding to recent events. So I'm interested to hear about it. I'd say that we need to put that in the context of other indicators. So I don't know what to make of that. That's an interesting fact. I'm glad to be apprised of it. I would not have expected it to answer your question directly.
It's certainly something that I think requires further conversation.
Yes.
And when you talk about the Pacific School of Religion, did that become the Graduate Theological Union, the GT?
Pacific School of Religion is one of a number of seminaries and divinity schools that formed together to make the Graduate Theological Union. So the Graduate Theological Union includes, for example, the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, the Episcopalian one. It includes San Francisco Theological Seminary, although I guess that's defunct now, the Presbyterians, and several others. There are quite a few of these seminaries. I think the Unitarians might have pulled out now, and the Jesuits, I think, moved to San Francisco. But the Graduate Theological Union in its strongest days, 20, 30, 40 years ago, included all of these div schools and the great library. The Graduate Theological Union has a fantastic library. And that was built partly when all these different seminaries pooled their their stuff for the library. So Graduate Theological Union is an institution that has its own agendas and its own programs, but it's the most important, I think everybody would agree, by sponsoring this fantastic library. So it's a very real presence. But the Pacific School of Religion was the only one of the Berkeley seminaries and div schools that had this national standing as a flagship for the campaign for a more cosmopolitan Protestantism. And that's where Buell Gallagher, for example, who ran a interracial church in South Berkeley and close to Howard Thurman, he was at the Pacific School of Religion.
Thank you for that history. That's wonderful. One of the questions that came in was from Sean, who asks, is interested in the money, the oil money, and the evangelicals, and asks if your current book, do you explore that further, or is there anything else more that you might like to say about it now?
Yeah, I do talk about that in the book, but there are two other books that do a whole lot on this, and that's something that I pick up and mention in my book, but build on the scholarship of others. And the best book on that is by Darren Doshuk, D-O-C-H-U-K, Darren Doshuk, and it's called Anointed with Oil. And that's like a 500 or 600 page detailed account of oil money and Protestantism. The other book is by Kevin Kruse, a professor at Princeton, and damn it, I'm forgetting now the title of his book, but it's K-R-U-S-E, Kevin Kruse, K-R-U-S-E. These are the books that really give you all the details of what Howard Pugh does at what time and what the consequences are for evangelicalism. So there's a lot out there on that, and that's that they didn't need me for that.
Well, this is a really big question, and I know that we've only got a couple more minutes, but a former student of yours, who's now in our conversation today, David Fisher, asks about the areas of convergence between the evangelicals and the ecumenicals. Can you say what those shared concepts and beliefs are? Is there some highlights you can give?
It's quite a fascinating phenomenon to see more and more self-identified evangelicals talk about their progressivism on issues of LGBTQ, issues of race, issues of poverty. There's quite a lot of this now. And what I have found, I actually followed a number of these cases. Most of these are exercises in appropriation and effacement. They will basically copy what the ecumenical Protestants did and deny it, or they will at least not acknowledge it. So these are people who've been blasting the ecumenical Protestants for many years, and then suddenly you find that they're sort of agreeing with them, but of course you wouldn't want to acknowledge that. I'll give you an example. There's a very prominent evangelical writer, David Gushee, G-U-S-H-E-E. He's got a couple of books on this. One of them is called A New Christianity, Toward a New Christianity. Okay, so I pick up this book. I say, hey, this is great. Let's see what these progressive evangelicals are up to. So it's old-fashioned liberal Protestantism most of the way through. And that's fine. I mean, I'm glad to see the development of more progressive views, more cosmopolitan views. I think it's a healthy thing that a lot of evangelicals are reconsidering. And it may be mean-spirited to hold against them that they're not acknowledging where they got these ideas. But from a historian's point of view, having studied the history of the evangelical ecumenical dispute and noting the vitriol with which evangelicals have attacked ecumenicals, it's really quite striking to see now that they're coming around. And a lot of them are. This question that's been asked touches on a very important thing. And the switch of the editor of Christianity Today against Trump last year is a great example of that. So maybe there'll be a lot more of that. I don't know, but it is definitely the case that that's a new and important development.
Thank you. I think it is 11:31, and I fear that we have to come to a close. But I want to thank you enormously for the insight, and I think really a good reading list for us to take into the holidays. So thanks for joining us today, and thank you everybody who was able to join us for this hour. Please look for your email that will have a link to the recorded conversation. Thanks again.